The garage door rolled up with its usual slow electric hum, and that's when I realized someone in my neighborhood had just made a very expensive mistake. I stood there in my driveway, coffee still warm in my hand, staring into my own garage like I'd walked into the wrong house. Sitting dead center between my workbench and the wall of tool cabinets was a white Lexus RX 350 that absolutely did not belong to me. The chrome grille caught the morning sun and threw a glare straight into my eyes while the smell of motor oil and sawdust drifted out of the garage like nothing was wrong. For a few seconds I honestly wondered if I'd somehow parked it and forgotten, which would have been impressive considering I drive a beat-up Ford F-150 with a dent in the tailgate and a ladder rack that squeaks every time I hit 40 miles an hour. My name's Daniel Carter, 38 years old, HVAC technician, and the proud owner of a two-car garage that had just been mysteriously converted into someone else's private parking space. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked closer, squinting at the windshield. That's when I noticed the sticky note tucked neatly under the wiper blade. Bright yellow. Perfect handwriting. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who has never turned a wrench in their life. I peeled it off and read it once, then twice, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding what I was seeing. It said, temporary HOA parking. Your driveway blocks community access during weekend events. Thanks for supporting neighborhood standards. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes your brain just refuses to process the level of confidence it takes for a person to park their luxury SUV inside someone else's garage and leave a thank you note like they were borrowing a cup of sugar. The garage still smelled like the cedar shelves I built last fall, mixed with the faint metallic scent of tools and compressor oil. Everything was exactly where I left it the night before except for one detail that weighed about 4,000 pounds and cost more than my entire truck. I leaned against the door frame and took a slow sip of coffee while the morning sun crept across the driveway. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower started up, and the distant whine of a leaf blower drifted through the neighborhood like white noise. Normal Saturday morning in Willow Creek Estates, the kind of quiet HOA neighborhood where every mailbox matches and every lawn looks like it was trimmed with a ruler. Which brings us to the person who almost certainly owned the Lexus sitting in my garage. Linda Whitmore, 54 years old, HOA president for the past 3 years, drives a white Lexus, loves phrases like community standards and neighborhood harmony. The kind of woman who once measured my grass with an actual tape measure and told me it was a 1/4 inch above regulation height. Linda ran this cul-de-sac like a suburban mayor with a clipboard instead of a badge. But even for her, parking inside someone else's garage was a new level of bold. I stepped into the garage, the concrete cool under my boots, and looked around at the shelves, the tools, the workbench where I rebuild compressors on weekends. This wasn't a shared space. This wasn't a driveway or a curb or some gray HOA technicality. This was my garage, my property, and someone had just parked a luxury SUV in it like they owned the place. I glanced at the garage door opener mounted on the wall, then back at the Lexus sitting comfortably between my tool cabinets. That's when a slow smile crept across my face, because Linda Whitmore thought she'd found herself a convenient parking spot. What she'd actually done was give me a very interesting idea. I stood there for another minute letting the situation settle in my head while the garage motor ticked quietly above me, cooling down after opening the door. If you had asked me the day before whether someone in my neighborhood would park inside my garage without asking, I probably would have laughed and said people were not that bold. But Willow Creek Estates had a way of surprising you. I bought this house 4 years ago after 10 straight years of crawling through attics, installing heating systems all over Central Texas. When you spend half your life inside ductwork and insulation, you start dreaming about simple things. A quiet street. A garage where you can actually build something on weekends. A place where nobody tells you what color your mailbox should be. The house checked every box. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a solid 2-car. Garage with enough room for a workbench, a compressor, and every tool I have collected since I was 19 years old. I paid an extra $12,000 for that garage during the closing negotiation, and I remember the realtor laughing when I insisted it was the most important part of the property. She thought I was joking. Anyone who works with their hands understands exactly why I was not. That garage is where I rebuild motors, sharpen tools, and sometimes sit on a folding chair late at night listening to a baseball game while organizing bolts and fittings into labeled drawers. It smells like cedar wood, motor oil, and the faint electric scent of the air compressor after a long run. It is not fancy, but every inch of that space belongs to me. Or at least it did until this morning. I walked slowly around the Lexus, studying the way it was parked with perfect confidence like it had been there for years. The tires were lined up neatly with the crack in the concrete floor, and the driver's side mirror sat about 6 inches from my tool chest. Whoever parked it had not rushed. They had taken their time. That told me everything I needed to know about the person responsible. Most people would hesitate before pulling into someone else's garage. Linda Whitmore was not most people. Linda believed the Homeowners Association was less of a neighborhood committee and more of a governing authority. 3 months after I moved in, she knocked on my door with a clipboard and a smile that looked friendly until you heard what she was actually saying. She explained that community standards help protect property values, and that the association appreciated my cooperation with certain minor adjustments. Those minor adjustments included trimming a tree branch that hung 2 inches past the sidewalk line, repainting a mailbox post that she believed was the wrong shade of black, and moving my trash cans because they were visible from the street on the wrong day of the week. None of it was technically illegal, but all of it came with the same polite tone that suggested refusing was not really an option. Over time, the neighborhood learned how Linda operated. She was not loud, and she was not rude. She was organized. She carried binders full of printed rules and quoted them like a lawyer, reading contract terms. And every conversation ended with the same calm sentence: "We all share responsibility for the community." Standing in my garage that morning, staring at her Lexus parked comfortably beside my workbench, I realized something important. Linda Whitmore truly believed that sentence applied to my garage as well. I did not need to check the license plate to confirm it was Linda Whitmore's Lexus. The entire neighborhood knew that vehicle the same way people recognize a fire truck, by sound alone. White paint polished so bright it reflected the sky, chrome wheels that probably cost more than my entire tool cabinet, and that little HOA parking permit sticker sitting proudly on the lower corner of the windshield like a badge of authority. Linda loved symbols of authority. She drove them, wore them, printed them on official-looking letters, and taped them to clipboards like they carried legal weight. I could practically hear her voice already, calm and confident, explaining how this whole situation somehow made perfect sense in her version of community logic. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the garage filled the air while I walked slowly around the Lexus again, noticing the details. The engine was still slightly warm, meaning she had parked here recently. A faint scent of expensive leather drifted out through the tiny gap in the driver's side window. Everything about the car screamed careful ownership except for one small detail. It was parked inside a building she did not own. I stepped back toward the driveway and glanced down the street. Willow Creek Estates looked exactly like it always did on a Saturday morning. Lawns trimmed within regulation height, identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers along the curb, and the distant buzz of yard equipment drifting through the warm Texas air. A few houses down, Mr. Patel was washing his pickup truck while country music played softly from a portable radio. Across the street, a kid rode a bicycle in slow circles around the cul-de-sac. Normal neighborhood life moving along like nothing unusual had happened. But inside my garage sat the physical proof that Linda Whitmore had slowly been pushing the limits of her authority for years. The first time I realized how far she was willing to go happened during my second month living here. I had installed a new outdoor air conditioning unit behind the house, completely within city code and fully permitted. 2 days later, Linda showed up with a printed notice explaining that mechanical equipment visible from certain angles could negatively impact neighborhood aesthetics. She suggested I build a decorative enclosure around it. I explained politely that the unit was already installed according to city regulations. She nodded, smiled, and reminded me that association guidelines sometimes went beyond city code. That was Linda's specialty. She operated in that quiet gray area where rules sounded official but rarely held up under real scrutiny. Over time, neighbors learned to avoid conflict with her, because arguing with someone who carried a 3-ring binder full of printed bylaws felt exhausting. People trimmed their hedges when she asked, moved their trash cans when she complained, and generally let her behave like the unofficial manager of the entire block. I looked back at the Lexus again and let out a slow breath. This time, though, Linda had crossed a line that was impossible to pretend did not exist. A driveway might invite debate. A lawn might invite opinions. But a garage was different. A garage had walls, a door, and a very clear definition of ownership. I set my empty coffee cup on the workbench and reached into my pocket for my phone, scrolling through the contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Not a lawyer. Not the police. Just the airline app one had installed a few weeks earlier while daydreaming about taking a vacation I had been putting off for years. Because the more I thought about Linda Whitmore's Lexus sitting peacefully inside my garage, the more I realized I might not need to argue with her at all. I leaned against the workbench for a moment and opened the airline application on my phone while the quiet Saturday morning rolled on outside. The screen lit up with a list of destinations and flight prices that I had been browsing for weeks, but never actually booked. Florida. 2 weeks. Ocean air instead of attic insulation and compressor oil. I had been telling myself I would plan the trip eventually once work slowed down, but work never slowed down. Air conditioners fail in the Texas heat every single day, and people tend to panic when their thermostat climbs past 80 degrees. I had postponed that vacation 3 times already. Standing there in my garage, staring at Linda Whitmore's Lexus resting comfortably beside my tool cabinets, I finally realized something. The timing might actually be perfect. The phone buzzed softly in my hand as the app loaded flight options. Monday morning departure from Austin. Return 14 days later. The price was not bad either. I scrolled through the details while the faint smell of sawdust and motor oil drifted around the garage like it always did. The Lexus sat silent in the middle of the concrete floor, its polished paint reflecting the rows of tools hanging on the wall. The whole situation suddenly felt less like a problem and more like an opportunity waiting patiently for the right decision. I tapped the purchase button before I had time to overthink it. The confirmation email arrived almost instantly with a soft chime from my phone speaker. 2 weeks in Florida, starting Monday morning. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked around the garage again, imagining how the next few days might unfold. Linda would eventually come back looking for her car. That much was certain. She probably assumed I would move it, or call her, or knock on her door and politely ask her to remove it. That was how most people in the neighborhood handled things when Linda pushed a little too far. They tried to reason with her. They explained boundaries. They debated rules and bylaws like they were negotiating a contract. I had watched that pattern play out for years. It never really changed anything. Linda always found another paragraph in the HOA guidelines that supported whatever decision she had already made. I walked over to the wall-mounted control panel for the garage door and pressed the button. The motor hummed again, and the heavy door began to roll downward toward the concrete floor. Sunlight slowly disappeared from the garage as the metal panels lowered inch by inch until the bottom seal touched the ground with a soft thump. The Lexus was now sitting in a fully closed building that only one person on this street had the remote access to operate. Me. I glanced at the keypad beside the door, then at the small camera mounted near the ceiling that recorded everything that happened in this space. The system sent motion alerts directly to my phone whenever the door opened or closed. It was originally installed for tool security after a neighbor down the street had a lawnmower stolen a couple years back. At the time, it seemed like a practical precaution. Now it looked more like a front row seat to whatever Linda Whitmore planned to do next. Outside, the neighborhood remained calm and quiet. A breeze rustled through the oak trees lining the street, while a pickup truck rolled slowly past the house toward the main road. Nobody seemed aware that a very expensive Lexus was currently sitting inside a garage that would remain closed for quite a while. I turned off the lights, stepped into the driveway, and locked the side door behind me. Monday morning was only 2 days away, and for the first time in months I was actually looking forward to leaving town. Sunday morning arrived with the slow, quiet rhythm that always settles over Willow Creek Estates after the early joggers go home and the lawn mowers take a break. Sunlight stretched across my driveway in long, pale lines while I loaded a small suitcase into the back of my pickup truck. The air smelled like fresh grass and warm pavement, the kind of ordinary suburban morning that makes everything feel predictable. Inside the house, my phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter. Then again. I walked in, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and glanced down at the screen. The motion alert from the garage camera had triggered. I opened the camera feed and leaned casually against the counter while the video played. There was Linda Whitmore standing in front of my closed garage door with her hands on her hips, wearing the same pastel blue jacket she always wore during neighborhood meetings. Even through the camera microphone, I could hear the faint metallic rattle as she tried the handle. Of course it did not move. The garage door remained closed, solid and quiet, exactly the way a locked door is supposed to behave. Linda stepped back, looked around the driveway, and then leaned closer to read the small security sticker near the keypad. I could almost imagine the thoughts running through her head. She probably expected the garage to open automatically. After all, she had already parked her car inside. Why would the owner of the house suddenly decide to secure the building afterward? The camera captured every movement in clear high definition. Linda tapped something on her phone, probably checking messages or dialing a number, then knocked twice on the side door of the garage. The hollow echo carried through the microphone like someone tapping on an empty drum. Nobody answered because nobody was home. I took another slow sip of coffee while watching the scene unfold on my phone. After a minute, Linda stepped back toward the driveway and looked at the closed door again, her posture stiff with the kind of confusion that appears when a simple assumption turns out to be incorrect. She walked down the driveway, paused near the street, and then turned back once more to stare at the building like she expected the door to magically lift itself open. It did not. The garage remained quiet. The Lexus remained inside. The camera alert ended and the screen returned to normal. I set the phone down and finished packing a few last items for the trip. By the time I pulled out of the driveway 20 minutes later, the street looked peaceful again. Mr. Patel was trimming the edge of his lawn while the same country music station played softly from his radio. Across the cul-de-sac, a dog barked once and then settled back down into the shade. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. The only difference was sitting quietly behind the closed garage door of my house, where a white Lexus rested between a tool cabinet and a workbench while its owner slowly began to realize something unusual had just happened. I drove toward the highway with the windows down and the warm breeze filling the truck cab, already imagining the sound of ocean waves instead of air compressors. Monday morning would bring the flight to Florida, but something told me Linda Whitmore was going to have a very interesting Sunday. Monday morning arrived with the quiet hum of the Austin airport long before sunrise. The terminal lights reflected off polished tile floors while travelers rolled suitcases past coffee stands that smelled like roasted beans and warm pastries. I sat near the gate with a backpack at my feet and a boarding pass on my phone, watching planes taxi slowly across the dark runway outside the windows. For the first time in months, I was not thinking about compressors, thermostats, or emergency repair calls. The only sound in my ears was the soft boarding announcement echoing across the gate area and the distant rumble of jet engines warming up for departure. My phone vibrated against the metal armrest beside me. A notification from the garage security system appeared on the screen. Motion detected. I tapped the alert and the live camera feed opened instantly. The view showed the familiar concrete floor of my garage and the white Lexus sitting quietly under the ceiling lights exactly where it had been parked 2 days earlier. But this time there was someone else in the frame. Linda Whitmore stood near the front bumper of the car with her arms crossed and her phone pressed against her ear. Even through the small speaker on my phone, I could hear the faint echo of her voice bouncing around the empty garage. The system had recorded everything automatically when the door opened. That meant Linda had managed to get inside somehow, most likely by convincing a locksmith or a neighbor that the vehicle belonged to her and needed to be retrieved. But the important detail was not how she entered the garage. The important detail was that the garage door had closed again behind her when the motion sensor finished its automatic cycle. The Lexus was still parked inside. Linda Whitmore was now standing inside the same locked building as her car. I leaned back in the airport chair and watched quietly as she walked around the vehicle, examining the closed door like someone trying to solve a puzzle that should have been simple. She pressed the wall control panel once. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The remote access for the system was linked directly to my phone and required a code that only I knew. Linda stepped back and looked toward the camera for a moment, though she clearly did not realize it was recording every second. She tried the side door next, twisting the handle twice before stepping away again. The calm confidence she normally carried during HOA meetings had disappeared. In its place was the cautious pacing of someone realizing that control of the situation belonged to someone else entirely. A boarding announcement echoed across the terminal behind me while I continued watching the screen. Passengers lined up at the gate as the airline attendant scanned boarding passes one by one. On my phone, Linda paced slowly across the garage floor again, her heels clicking faintly against the concrete while The Lexus sat perfectly still beside her. She spoke into her phone with quick gestures, probably explaining to someone on the other end that she was temporarily stuck. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood up when my boarding group was called. Outside the wide airport windows, the sunrise had just begun to color the horizon in pale orange light. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude over the Gulf of Mexico, Linda Whitmore was still standing inside a locked garage in Willow Creek Estates, slowly discovering that sometimes the simplest doors in the world can become very difficult to open when the wrong person decides to close them. The first thing I noticed when the plane landed in Florida was the sound of the ocean wind moving through the palm trees near the airport parking lot. It was the kind of soft rushing sound you never hear in Central Texas, like waves breathing somewhere just out of sight. Warm air rolled across the pavement as I stepped outside with my backpack and sunglasses, and for the first time in a long, while the only schedule I had to follow involved sunshine and salt water. I checked into a small beachside hotel about 20 minutes later, the kind of place with faded wooden railings and the smell of sunscreen drifting through the lobby. The balcony outside my room faced the ocean, and from up there the horizon stretched wide and empty like a quiet promise that nothing urgent existed for the next 14 days. I kicked off my shoes, set my phone on the small table near the sliding glass door, and listened to the steady rhythm of waves hitting the shore below. It felt strange in the best possible way. No service calls. No thermostats failing at midnight. No HOA newsletters showing up in my mailbox explaining which shade of paint counted as approved beige. Just wind, water, and sunlight reflecting across the surface of the Gulf. The phone buzzed on the table sometime later while I was leaning on the balcony rail watching pelicans glide across the water. Another alert from the garage security system. I picked up the phone and opened the live camera feed again. The image showed the familiar concrete floor back in Willow Creek Estates, but this time Linda Whitmore was not alone inside the garage. Two other figures stood near. The Lexus, both wearing the kind of neat office clothing that suggested they had arrived to solve a problem rather than create one. One man held a clipboard while the other stood with his hands in his pockets looking around the garage like he was measuring the situation in quiet calculations. Linda stood beside them pointing toward the closed door and speaking with the tight gestures of someone explaining how a simple misunderstanding had somehow become complicated. Even through the faint audio from the camera microphone, I could hear the hollow echo of their footsteps against the concrete floor. The man with the clipboard walked toward the door control panel and pressed the button once. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. The motor above remained silent. Linda spoke again, faster this time, probably repeating the same explanation she had given to someone earlier that morning. The second man walked slowly around the Lexus and glanced toward the ceiling camera for a moment before turning back to the others. I leaned against the balcony rail and watched the entire scene unfold from nearly 1,000 miles away while the ocean breeze moved softly across the water behind me. The difference between the two places could not have been clearer. In Florida, the sun hung bright over the Gulf while waves rolled toward the shore in calm, endless patterns. Back in Texas, 3 people now stood inside a locked garage staring at a car that had been parked there without permission. I set the phone down on the balcony table and let the sound of the ocean fill the air again. Whatever conversation was happening inside that garage would continue whether I watched it or not. The Lexus was still parked exactly where Linda had left it, and I still had 13 days of vacation remaining. By the 4th day of my vacation, the rhythm of the ocean had completely replaced the sound of compressors and service calls in my head. Morning started with sunlight spilling across the balcony floor and the distant cry of seagulls drifting over the water. The air smelled like salt and sunscreen instead of dust and attic insulation. I would walk down the wooden steps to the beach, watch the waves roll in for a while, then wander back to the hotel with sand in my shoes and absolutely no reason to check a thermostat anywhere in the state of Texas. Late that afternoon, I was sitting at an outdoor table near the shoreline with a cold glass of iced tea when my phone vibrated again against the wood. The garage alert had triggered for the 3rd time that week. I opened the camera feed and leaned back in the chair while the breeze moved softly across the beach. The image showed the same concrete floor, the same Lexus, and the same closed garage door that had not moved since the morning I left town. This time there were 4 people standing inside the garage. Linda Whitmore stood near the front of the car, while two of the men from earlier paced slowly across the floor with careful expressions. A third man had joined them, older, gray hair, wearing a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly above his elbows. He carried a folder under one arm and spoke with the calm gestures of someone used to explaining inconvenient facts. Even through the faint microphone audio, I could hear the steady echo of his voice bouncing off the garage walls while Linda listened with her arms crossed tightly across her jacket. The man pointed once toward the Lexus, then toward the garage door, then finally toward the sidewall where the small property line diagram hung near my workbench. I recognized that diagram immediately. It was the survey map from my closing paperwork that showed the exact boundaries of the lot, including the structure of the garage. The older man tapped the paper once with his finger and continued speaking in the same calm tone. Linda said something in response, her voice sharper now, but the man simply shook his head slowly and continued explaining. One of the other men stepped toward the door control panel again and pressed the button. The motor remained silent, just like before. The garage door did not move. I watched the entire conversation unfold from nearly 1,000 miles away while the sun lowered slowly toward the horizon behind the phone screen. Waves rolled onto the sand in steady quiet patterns while the sky shifted from bright blue to deep orange. Inside the garage in Willow Creek Estates, the group stood quietly for a moment after the explanation finished. No one touched the car. No one attempted the door again. Linda looked toward the Lexus, then toward the closed garage door, then finally toward the small ceiling camera that continued recording everything without blinking. I set the phone down on the table beside my drink and listened to the ocean for a while before checking the screen again. The garage was empty now. The Lexus remained exactly where it had been all week, parked neatly between the tool cabinet and the workbench while the door stayed closed and locked exactly the way it had been since the morning I left town. 14 days passed faster than I expected. The morning I returned to Texas, the air felt dry and familiar again, carrying that faint dusty heat that always sits over Austin in the early afternoon. My pickup rolled slowly through the entrance of Willow Creek Estates while the same quiet streets stretched ahead exactly the way I remembered them. Mailboxes lined the curb in perfect rows, and the oak trees cast long shadows across the asphalt. Nothing about the neighborhood looked different, but as I turned onto my street, I noticed something I had not seen in 2 weeks. Linda Whitmore stood in my driveway beside the closed garage door with two other people waiting nearby. One of them was the older man with gray hair I had seen on the camera earlier. The other carried a small clipboard and watched the driveway, like someone supervising an inspection. Linda crossed her arms the moment my truck rolled to a stop near the curb. The late afternoon sun reflected off the white Lexus still resting inside the garage behind the metal door. I stepped out of the truck and stretched my shoulders after the long flight. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of a lawn sprinkler ticking slowly somewhere down the block. Linda walked forward first, her shoes tapping against the concrete with quick, impatient steps. The confidence in her voice had returned, but it carried a tight edge now. She explained that her vehicle had been inaccessible for 2 weeks and that the situation needed to be resolved immediately. I listened calmly while the warm air moved across the driveway and the smell of cut grass drifted through the neighborhood. When she finished speaking, the older man with the folder stepped closer and introduced himself as a legal advisor for the association. He spoke in the same steady tone I had heard through the garage camera earlier, explaining that the car needed to be retrieved so the matter could be closed properly. I nodded once and walked to the control panel mounted beside the garage door. The motor hummed softly when I pressed the button. The metal panels rolled upward slowly while sunlight spilled across the concrete floor inside the garage. The white Lexus sat exactly where it had been parked 2 weeks earlier between the tool cabinet and the workbench. Not a single inch had moved. The air inside the garage still carried the familiar scent of cedar shelves and motor oil. Linda stepped forward quickly toward the car while the others watched from the driveway. I held up one hand for a moment before she reached the door handle. Then I handed the man with the folder a printed sheet of paper I had prepared during the flight home. He glanced down at the document and adjusted his glasses. It was a simple itemized storage notice listing the dates the vehicle had occupied the private structure along with the standard commercial rate for secured indoor vehicle storage in Austin. 14 days multiplied by the daily rate came to $1,800. The man read the number twice before looking up at Linda. The quiet street remained completely still while the sprinkler down the block clicked softly against the pavement. I leaned casually against the workbench and folded my arms while they discussed the paper in low voices. Finally, the man nodded once and handed the document back to Linda. She stood there for a moment staring at the garage floor before reaching into her purse. 10 minutes later, the Lexus engine started and the car backed slowly down the driveway. I watched it disappear around the corner before pressing the button again. The garage door rolled closed with a familiar hum, and the lock clicked gently into place. The workbench, the tools, and the quiet smell of cedar and motor oil were exactly where they belonged. And for the first time since moving into Willow Creek Estates, nobody on that street ever tried to park inside my garage again.